The ANC's Integrity Committee in Gauteng is beginning its probe into a 125 million rand PPE tender scandal. Allegations implicate some high-ranking government officials, including spokesperson for the President Khusela Diko and Gauteng Health MEC Bandile Masuku. Let's speak to Advocate Paul Hoffman, who says Diko's alleged involvement puts the President in a situation where he's in breach, possibly, of his obligation to avoid the risk of a conflict of interest. Advocate Hoffman joins us now by Skype. Advocate, good to have you on the program. So explain how this puts the President in a rather compromising position.
Yes, good afternoon, Temekile, and to your viewers as well. The situation is that the law, in fact the Constitution, requires the President to avoid any situation in which there is a risk of a conflict, not necessarily an actual conflict, just the risk. That rule was discussed in the Nkandla matter, and the Chief Justice made it very clear that nothing needs to happen, nothing needs to go wrong. If there is a risk of a conflict, then the President is under a duty to avoid it. So if his spokesperson is involved in a situation in which it seems that her husband has been awarded a huge tender, then the risk of a conflict is that there are people in the President's office who benefit from public procurement, which is a no-no in anybody's language. And it's exactly the same with the MEC Masuta, who, as a politician, should actually have nothing to do with procurement at all. So the President has now to put his spokesperson on the carpet and ask her to explain what's going on, invite her to resign, and if she doesn't, put her through a disciplinary process, which will probably end in her dismissal as his spokesperson.
Let me ask you this then, Advocate, just on that point that you're making about Khusela Diko and what the President should be doing. She's taken a leave of absence. She is going to appear before an ANC integrity process. There is the SIU investigation. Is all of that not enough to avoid the risk, as you were saying, of a possible conflict of interest that affects the Presidency specifically?
No, it isn't enough. This isn't about the ANC's internal rules. This is about the law of the country. And the same applies to Masuta. I know that they are going to be put on the carpet by the ANC, which is a good thing because the ANC should see to it that its public representatives and their employees are as pure as the driven snow. But that doesn't detract from the factual matrix that we are dealing with here, which is that the tender system was abused in order to get jobs for pals and in order to prefer those who are politically well connected above those who simply try and do an honest day's work with the state by procuring goods.
So why would the sacking of Khusela Diko in this instance, as you suggested earlier, be more preferred than perhaps the President saying, well, I have taken the action of suspending her until she's been cleared through a criminal process?
I don't think she's committed a crime. I think that her problem is that she has placed the President himself in breach of his obligations under Section 96 of the Constitution, and for doing that, she must fall on her sword, and if she refuses to fall on her sword, then she has to go through a disciplinary process which says you are working for a man who is not allowed by law to get involved in a situation in which there's a risk of a conflict. You put him in such a situation. Why should you be allowed to carry on working for him? That's really the inwardness of it, and it has nothing to do with criminality. It may have something to do with Section 217, which says that fair, equitable, transparent, cost-effective and competitive procurement of goods and services on the part of the state is a constitutional requirement. It cannot be competitive and it cannot be fair if a cozy job is given to a friend in need when the COVID tendering was done.
What about the rights of Khusela Diko as an employee then? Because I'd imagine, like the rest of us, she also has some protection, and the president cannot just act against her, perhaps without an accurate or solid ground on which he would take the action against her. Let's phrase it that way.
Yes, no, like every other employee in the country, she is entitled to fair labor practices. But one of the things that she has to do as the presidential spokesman is see to it that she keeps her boss on the right side of the law. That's a fundamental part of her job. And part of that is to avoid the risk of a conflict. Well, she's far from avoiding the risk of the conflict. She's created an actual conflict by her pally-pally relationship with the Masukas and her husband. And that is a definite no-no, and it is something which ought to impel her to fall on her sword rather than to kick the problem into touch and hope that everybody forgets that she has done something wrong and unforgivable, and that she should, in fact, be relieved of her duties in the office of the president.
And I'm wondering then how a court, if the situation between Khusela Diko and the president then would to end up before a judge, would then be weighed in terms of, again, the issue of the conflict of interest versus the constitutionally enshrined rights of an employee.
Yes, as I say, she is entitled to fair labor practices, but if the president puts her on the carpet and says to her, look what you've done, you've placed me at risk of being in a conflict because my employees are involved in dodgy tender processes that don't comply with the requirements of the Public Finance Management Act and the Constitution itself, then she must either give an explanation. I didn't know what my husband was up to. I'm terribly sorry. In which event she may get a warning and be allowed to carry on. Or I knew exactly what was going on. It was cooked up between us and the Masutas, and I'm terribly sorry. I don't believe it's necessary for me to be suspended or to be demoted or to be transferred or to be fired. And let the president decide on the basis of the outcome of the disciplinary inquiry what should happen. But if he's trying to run a clean ship in relation to COVID procurements, then he ought not to take any fancy excuses for what has happened, because what has happened has clearly placed him at risk of being in a conflict situation because an employee of his is getting the benefit indirectly through her husband of a huge COVID procurement deal.
And we're speaking, Prof, about the Masukus, not the Masutas. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. That's Advocate, in fact, Paul Hoffman speaking to us this afternoon.